April 22, 1945. Somewhere along the frozen Moselle River Valley, western Germany. The morning arrives without mercy. Snow falls in thick, silent curtains over the skeletal remains of a field hospital erected in what was once a schoolhouse. Inside, the air smells of carbolic acid, gangrene, and desperation. A young German nurse, her name is Margaret, though history will not remember it, wraps her chapped hands around a tin cup of ersatz coffee made from acorns and chicory root. The liquid is barely warm. Outside, the temperature has dropped to -18 degrees Celsius. The windows are gone, blown out weeks ago by artillery. Blankets stuffed into the frames do little against the cold that creeps through every crack, every doorway, every breath. She moves between the rows of wounded soldiers lying on straw mattresses, their feet blackened and swollen beneath threadbare wool blankets. Frostbite. The word itself seems inadequate for what she witnesses. Toes that have turned the color of coal, skin splitting open like overripe fruit, the smell of tissue dying from within. She has seen this before, many times now, in the brutal winter of this dying war. The treatment is always the same. Wrap the affected limbs, keep them elevated, wait. Sometimes they amputate. Sometimes the men simply die. The Reich's medical guidelines, typed on thin paper and distributed months ago, say nothing useful. Rub the flesh with snow to restore circulation, they once advised. Immerse in hot water immediately. She has tried both. The results were catastrophic. Tissue damage accelerated, gangrene spreading faster, screams that still echo in her sleep. The war has been lost for months now, though no one dares say it aloud. The Americans are coming from the west, the Soviets from the east. Germany is being crushed between two millstones, and here, in this frozen corridor of suffering, Margaret tends to boys, 17, 18 years old, whose feet will never carry them home. She does not yet know that within weeks everything she believes about medicine, about the enemy, about the very nature of this war, will be overturned by men in olive-drab uniforms carrying supplies she cannot imagine. To understand what happens next, one must first understand what the German medical establishment had become by the winter of 1945. The Third Reich's healthcare system, once among the most advanced in Europe, had been systematically corrupted by ideology and depleted by total war. The concept of Gesundheitsführung, health leadership, had transformed medicine from a humanitarian science into an instrument of racial policy and military necessity. Resources flowed first to the Waffen-SS, then to the Wehrmacht, and finally, if anything remained, to civilian hospitals and field stations. By January 1945, there was almost nothing left. German military nurses, many of them members of the Deutsches Rotkreuz or the NS Schwesternschaft, the National Socialist Nurses Corps, had been trained under a system that emphasized duty, obedience, and racial hygiene over patient care. Their education was practical but narrow, shaped by wartime scarcity and ideological rigidity. Pharmacology was limited to what could be synthesized from domestic resources. Surgical techniques prioritized speed over finesse. Limbs were amputated to save morphine. Wounds were sutured without adequate antiseptic. Pain management was a luxury. Anesthesia was reserved for officers. Frostbite, in particular, had become an epidemic. The winter of 1944–45 was one of the coldest in European history. German soldiers, retreating across frozen rivers and through snow-laden forests, lacked adequate winter clothing. The boots issued to infantry divisions in the final year of the war were made from ersatz leather, pressed cardboard and synthetic compounds that disintegrated in wet conditions. Socks were often absent. Wool was a memory. Tens of thousands of men suffered cold injuries, and the medical corps had no effective treatment. The official doctrine, derived from outdated textbooks and expedient guesswork, was actively harmful. Rubbing frostbitten tissue with snow, once believed to restore circulation, instead caused ice crystals in the cells to rupture membranes, destroying muscle and nerve from within. Rapid rewarming in hot water led to thermal shock, massive edema, and accelerated necrosis. German doctors and nurses, working with the tools and knowledge they had, watched helplessly as limbs blackened and men died from secondary infections. Margaret has learned to recognize the stages. First-degree frostbite, pallor, numbness, slight swelling. These men might recover. Second degree, blistering, tissue hardening, pain upon rewarming. Amputation likely. Third degree, complete tissue death, blackened extremities, systemic sepsis. The men rarely survived. She moves among them now, changing dressings, spooning thin broth into mouths that barely respond, writing letters to families who will never receive them. She has become efficient at grief. And then the Americans arrive. The date is February 9th, 1945. Margaret hears them before she sees them. The rumble of engines, the sharp commands in a foreign language, the metallic clatter of equipment being unloaded. Her stomach tightens. She has heard the stories, whispered in darkened wards and basement shelters. The Americans are vengeful. They will burn hospitals. They will execute nurses who served the Wehrmacht. They will. But when the first American soldiers enter the schoolhouse, they do not carry torches or pistols. They carry boxes. Wooden crates stenciled with white letters, U.S. Army Medical Corps. A captain, a doctor, she realizes, by the caduceus on his collar, walks through the rows of wounded, his face impassive. He is followed by 2 enlisted men, a sergeant with a medical bag, and a young lieutenant who speaks halting but intelligible German. The lieutenant approaches her. "You are the nurse in charge?" She nods, unable to speak. "We are establishing a forward aid station here. Your patients will be treated. We need your assistance." She expects cruelty. She receives a clipboard. Over the next 3 days, Margaret witnesses a transformation that defies everything she has been taught. The Americans do not segregate the wounded by nationality. German soldiers, some still wearing fragments of Wehrmacht uniforms, are treated alongside American GIs. The medical supplies that emerge from those wooden crates seem endless. Morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, sterilized bandages, plasma bags, penicillin in glass vials. Margaret has not seen penicillin in 2 years. The last supplies were reserved for Luftwaffe pilots. Now, an American medic injects it into the arm of a 19-year-old panzer grenadier without hesitation. But it is the treatment of frostbite that shatters her understanding of medicine itself. The American approach is methodical, almost ritualistic in its precision. A medical sergeant, his name is Thompson, she learns, from Ohio, establishes a warming station in the schoolhouse's largest room. Portable kerosene heaters are brought in, their blue flames casting wavering light across walls pocked with shrapnel scars. The temperature inside is raised gradually, carefully, monitored with thermometers. Not too fast. Not too hot. This is the first revelation. Controlled rewarming. Thompson explains through the lieutenant's translation. Rapid heating destroys tissue. We rewarm slowly, immerse the affected limbs in water heated to precisely 37 to 40 degrees Celsius. No hotter. The tissue must thaw from within, gradually, allowing circulation to resume without shock. Margaret watches as they prepare basins of warm water, testing the temperature obsessively, adding hot water in small increments, maintaining that narrow range. A German soldier, his feet blackened to the ankles, is brought to the station. She expects him to scream when his feet are lowered into the water. He does. The pain of rewarming is excruciating, nerve endings reawakening after icy dormancy. But the Americans are ready. Morphine is administered. Not a single cigarette hoarded and rationed, but enough to manage the agony. The soldier's screams subside to whimpers, then to shallow breathing. We keep the limbs immersed for 20 to 40 minutes, Thompson continues, his voice steady, clinical. Until the tissue is pliable, pink color returns, and we can detect a pulse. Then we dry gently, apply sterile dressings, elevate the limbs, and wait. No rubbing. No massage. No ice. Margaret feels something crack inside her. How many men has she lost to ignorance? How many feet has she seen amputated because she rubbed them with snow, because she followed the guidelines, because she did not know? The American method is not merely different, it is the opposite of everything she has been taught. And it works. Over the following weeks, as the front lines shift and the war's end becomes inevitable, Margaret is integrated into the American medical operation. She expects to be a prisoner, a laborer. Instead, she is treated as a colleague. The Americans call her Nurse Margaret. They teach her their protocols, share their supplies, explain their reasoning. A doctor from New York, Captain Lieberman, Jewish by his features and name, a fact that fills her with shame and confusion, demonstrates the vascular principles behind their treatment. Frostbite is an injury of circulation, he explains one evening, sketching diagrams on the back of a supply manifest. Ice crystals form in the extracellular space, drawing water from cells, causing dehydration and membrane collapse. The tissue doesn't die from cold alone, it dies from ischemia, from lack of blood flow. Our goal is to restore circulation gradually, minimize cellular trauma, prevent secondary thrombosis. Heparin helps. So does elevation. So does keeping the patient warm and hydrated. Hydration. Another revelation. The Americans have water purification tablets, portable stoves to melt snow, canteens that seem inexhaustible. German soldiers, dehydrated from weeks of retreat, are given warm broth, electrolyte solutions, even coffee, real coffee, dark and bitter and miraculous. Margaret sips a cup one morning and nearly weeps. She has not tasted coffee since 1943. The symbolic power of food becomes undeniable. The Americans arrive with abundance that seems almost obscene against the backdrop of German starvation. Cases of canned rations, Spam, corned beef, beans in tomato sauce. Chocolate bars distributed casually to wounded men. Cigarettes, not the ersatz tobacco rolled in newsprint that German soldiers smoke, but Lucky Strikes and Camels in pristine white paper. Margaret watches a young Wehrmacht soldier, both feet amputated below the knee, his future destroyed, accept a Hershey bar from an American medic. He holds it in trembling hands, staring at the brown wrapper as though it were a holy relic. Then he eats it slowly, tears running down his face. "They have so much," another German nurse whispers to Margaret one night. "How do they have so much?" Margaret does not answer. But she is beginning to understand. This is not merely abundance, it is a system, a philosophy made tangible. The Americans have logistics, infrastructure, industrial capacity operating on a scale that Germany never possessed, even in its victories. Every crate of medical supplies represents a functioning supply chain stretching back thousands of miles, from factories in Detroit and Chicago, across the Atlantic, through contested ports and bombed roads, to this frozen schoolhouse in the Rhineland. The Third Reich promised autarky, self-sufficiency, a fortress Europe feeding itself. The reality was ersatz coffee, cardboard boots, and frostbite. The Americans promised nothing. They simply delivered. The transformation in Margaret is gradual but irreversible. She begins to ask questions. Why was German medicine so ineffective? Why were their protocols so harmful? The answers are uncomfortable. Some of the German medical failures stem from genuine ignorance, Frostbite treatment was poorly understood even among Allied forces until systematic research began in 1943. But much of it stems from something darker, the Nazi regime's corruption of science itself. She learns that American frostbite protocols were developed through careful research and documentation. Studies conducted during the Battle of the Bulge, data collected from thousands of cold weather casualties, systematic trials comparing treatment methods. The U.S. Army Medical Department published field manuals based on evidence, distributed them widely, trained medics at every level. Medicine, for the Americans, was an evolving science, a collaborative effort to reduce suffering. German medicine, by contrast, had become dogma. Research was subordinated to ideology. Jewish doctors, some of the finest minds in European medicine, had been expelled, exiled, murdered. The brain drain began in 1933 and never stopped. By 1945, what remained was a hollowed-out profession, staffed by loyalists and opportunists, crippled by isolation from international medical communities. The treatments Margaret learned were not the best available. They were the only treatments permitted, codified by a regime that valued obedience over inquiry. Captain Lieberman, the Jewish doctor from New York, says nothing of this directly. But his presence is a silent rebuke. He treats German soldiers with the same meticulous care he provides to Americans. He teaches Margaret the principles of wound irrigation, the importance of sterile technique, the pharmacology of sulfa drugs. He does not mention that his grandparents fled Prussia in 1880, that his cousins died in Treblinka, that his very existence here, a Jew in an American uniform, saving German lives, represents a civilizational victory so complete it requires no commentary. One afternoon, as they work side by side debriding a gangrenous wound, Margaret gathers the courage to ask, "Why do you help us?" After everything, Lieberman does not look up from the wound. His hands, gloved and steady, continue their work. "Because you are patients. That is enough." She does not understand this. Not immediately. But over the following weeks, as the war collapses and the full horror of the concentration camps is revealed, photographs circulating among the troops, stories whispered in disbelief, she begins to grasp the enormity of what he means. The Americans could have practiced vengeance. They could have withheld medicine, denied treatment, let German soldiers die in agony as retribution for crimes beyond comprehension. Some probably wanted to. But the official policy, enforced from the highest command, was adherence to the Geneva Convention, to medical ethics, to a principle that even enemies deserve care. This, too, is abundance, not of food or supplies, but of moral surplus. A nation secure enough, wealthy enough, confident enough in its values to treat its enemies as human beings. The symbolic object that recurs throughout these weeks is the morphine syringe. It is a small thing, a disposable tube of aluminum and glass, designed for single-use injection. The Germans have something similar, ampoules of morphine, when they have them at all, but they are rationed, reserved, often withheld because supply is uncertain. The Americans carry syringes by the dozen. Every medic has them. Every aid station is stocked with them. They are used liberally, almost casually, to manage pain that would be considered inevitable in the German system. Margaret begins to associate the syringe with American medicine itself, portable, efficient, democratized. Pain relief is not a privilege, it is a standard. The suffering of a private is treated with the same urgency as that of an officer. This is so alien to her experience that she initially distrusts it. Surely, they will run out. Surely, someone will demand rationing, hierarchy, triage by value rather than need. But the supplies keep coming. The crates keep arriving. The syringes keep appearing in medics' pouches, glinting under lamplight, small metal promises that suffering can be alleviated. She watches a young American soldier, a medic barely 20 years old, from Louisiana by his drawl, inject morphine into a German SS trooper who had been found in a ditch, both legs shattered by artillery. The SS man is delirious with pain, muttering about betrayal and final victory. The American medic says nothing. He simply administers the injection, checks the man's pulse, marks the dose on his forehead with a grease pencil. 1 syringe, 1,430 hours, he writes. Then he moves to the next patient. Later, Margaret asks him, "Do you know who that man is? What he represents?" The medic shrugs. "He's a patient. That's all I need to know." This is the moral clarity she cannot reconcile with her previous worldview. The Reich spoke endlessly of strength, will, sacrifice. It created hierarchies of suffering, worthy and unworthy, German and subhuman, heroic and contemptible. The Americans, by contrast, offer a kind of blank universalism. If you are wounded, you will be treated. The ideology is so simple it seems naive. And yet it functions. The aid station operates with relentless efficiency. Mortality rates drop. Limbs are saved. Men who would have died under German care survive. The war ends on May 8, 1945. Margaret is still working in the aid station, now a semi-permanent hospital in a requisitioned manor house. The announcement is met with exhausted relief rather than celebration. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The Third Reich, which was to last 1,000 years, lasted 12. Margaret stands outside that evening, watching American trucks roll past on the highway. They are loaded with supplies, food, medicine, construction materials. The occupation is beginning. She thinks of the frostbitten soldiers, the morphine syringes, the chocolate bars, and real coffee. She thinks of Captain Lieberman, who saved German lives despite having every reason not to. She thinks of the warmth of those kerosene heaters, the precision of the water temperature, the careful elevation of swollen limbs. She realizes, with a clarity that is almost painful, that she has been on the wrong side of history. The epilogue to this story unfolds over decades. Margaret, if we allow her to stand for the thousands of German nurses who experienced similar conversions, continues to work in medicine. The American occupation authorities, in need of trained personnel, retain many German nurses and doctors, vetting them for war crimes but ultimately integrating them into the reconstruction effort. She learns more from the Americans in the months following the war than in all her previous training. She learns about antibiotics, about modern surgical techniques, about patient-centered care. She learns that medicine is not a weapon of state policy, but a service to humanity. The memory of those frozen weeks in early 1945 never leaves her. In the 1950s, when she trains a new generation of nurses in West Germany, she teaches them the American protocol for frostbite treatment. She describes the precise water temperature, the gradual rewarming, the importance of pain management. She does not tell them that she once treated frostbite by rubbing limbs with snow. Some shames are too deep to confess. The broader symbolism of what happened in that schoolhouse resonates through the postwar order. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, extended the logic of those wooden crates filled with medical supplies to an entire continent. American abundance, food, machinery, capital, expertise, flowed into devastated Europe, rebuilding economies, stabilizing democracies, integrating former enemies into a new Western alliance. The generosity was strategic, certainly, driven by Cold War calculations and the need to contain Soviet expansion. But it was also genuine, rooted in a national self-image that prized pragmatism and optimism, that believed problems could be solved through material intervention and technical expertise. Germany, divided and occupied, became a laboratory for this philosophy. In the West, American aid transformed a bombed-out wasteland into an economic miracle. The contrast with the Soviet zone, and later with East Germany, could not have been starker. On one side, prosperity, reconstruction, rising living standards, integration into a community of democracies. On the other, austerity, surveillance, stagnation, walls built to keep people in rather than invaders out. The difference was not merely economic but philosophical. The West offered abundance, the East, discipline. The West promised opportunity, the East, security. And in the end, abundance won. Margaret dies in 1987, 2 years before the Berlin Wall falls. She does not live to see the final vindication of the system that once invaded her country and taught her how to save lives. But perhaps she senses it, in those final years, as Soviet power visibly crumbles and East Germans begin to dream of escape. Perhaps she remembers the American soldiers in olive drab, the morphine syrettes, the kerosene heaters, the chocolate bars, the relentless kindness of strangers who had no reason to be kind. Perhaps she remembers being taught, by her enemies, what it means to heal. The story of German nurses learning American frostbite treatment is not merely a medical footnote. It is a parable about the nature of systems, the power of material abundance, and the moral consequences of ideology. The Third Reich built an empire on the promise of strength, racial purity, martial glory, historical destiny. It collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, unable to feed its people, clothe its soldiers, or heal its wounded. The United States, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, offered an alternative. A society built on production rather than plunder, on pragmatism rather than dogma, on the belief that problems have solutions and suffering can be alleviated. The morphine syrette, that small aluminum tube, becomes in this narrative a symbol of democratic capitalism at its best. Portable, efficient, widely distributed, designed to relieve pain rather than inflict it. It represents a system that could afford to be generous because its productivity was so vast, that could extend care to enemies because its moral framework insisted on universal human dignity, however imperfectly applied. And the lesson, painful and undeniable, is that ideology without abundance is cruelty. The Reich's racial theories, its glorification of sacrifice, its hierarchies of worth, all of it crumbled in the face of frostbite, cold, and the simple human need for warmth and healing. The Americans arrived with the answer. Not a superior ideology, but better logistics, better science, better supplies. They won the war not only on the battlefield but in the field hospital, in the warming station, in the methodical rewarming of frozen limbs. Margaret, standing in that frozen schoolhouse in January 1945, could not have imagined the world that was coming, a world in which Germany would be divided and rebuilt, in which American medicine would become the global standard, in which the abundance she witnessed would be systematized and exported, criticized and emulated, until even its enemies acknowledged that prosperity and democracy, for all their flaws, offered more than any totalitarian promise of strength through suffering. She learned to treat frostbite. In doing so, she learned what happens when a civilization chooses healing over glory, pragmatism over purity, abundance over sacrifice. The lesson was taught by men who had every reason to hate, but chose instead to care. And that choice, multiplied across millions of interactions in the ruins of Europe, built the post-war world. The cold of that January morning is long forgotten. But the warmth of those kerosene heaters, the precision of that water temperature, the mercy of those morphine syrettes, these endure. They are the memory of a moment when enemies became patients, when ideology gave way to evidence, when the simple act of teaching someone to heal became an argument for democracy itself. In the end, this is what abundance means. Not merely having enough, but having enough to share, even with those who do not deserve it, because the principle matters more than the grudge. The Americans could have let German soldiers die. They chose not to. That choice, repeated across countless frozen field hospitals and aid stations, was as decisive as any battle. It said, "We are different. We have something better. And we will prove it not by conquering, but by healing." That is the legacy of those weeks in early 1945, when German nurses learned from American medics how to save lives. It is a story about frostbite and morphine, about coffee and chocolate, about the meticulous temperature of water in a basin. But it is also a story about the systems we build, the values we embody, and the stubborn, difficult, essential truth that human dignity cannot be rationed, only honored or betrayed. Margaret chose to honor it. So did Captain Lieberman, Sergeant Thompson, and the young medic from Louisiana. So did the system that sent them, imperfect and contradictory, carrying wooden crates filled with supplies that said, "You are worth saving. All of you. Even you." And in that message, delivered in morphine and kerosene warmth and patient hands, a new world was born.